Friends, welcome. In this episode, I'm interviewing an incredible human being. He is Kenny Clewett. He co-leads Hello World, which is a global migration, integration, and refugee initiative for Ashoka. He's based in Spain. His work is especially focused on identifying and helping to scale these social innovation solutions underlying major social challenges, especially in migration, refugees, integration across Europe and the world now. Kenny started as a pastor in the United States, where he focused on cross-cultural faith-based facilitation, and that's where he shares on how he learned through apprenticeship with many pastors in the US to kind of see the difference between the solely preacher pastors and then pastors who are actually facilitating transformation. Kenny is also heavily invested into working in this, what they call an ecosystem accelerator. This is a concept that brings a very complex, diverse group of stakeholders to come together to really align and drive change forwards. We talk about it. We get into the details on how to organize these complex facilitations and how to deal with the sensitivities to meet people's needs and also push the change forward. So nice you're here. Let's get to this. Kenny, welcome. So nice to have you, my friend. Welcome to the show, and so excited to have you.
Very excited to be here.
Kenny, let's dive in, my friend. First time I got to connect with you was because we were organizing this program for faith-inspired change makers, spiritual change makers, and both you and I got to brainstorm and come up with ideas on how do we facilitate these experiences for change makers. And my first question to you is, when did you know you fell into like being this role of like an facilitator, a gatherer, a change maker? What happened to you that you came to this point? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, so throughout my whole life, first of all, it's great to be here and really excited about this and talking about facilitation, which is I don't even know if it's an art. It's like something you stumble into generally. But to answer your question, I grew up in faith environments where, you were doing a lot of stuff with others. You spent a lot of time with them. My parents led something that had to do with kids in control. So like the children would kind of lead different things as teenagers or whatever. So there's always a bit of that. But the moment that I kind of discovered the magic of facilitation was actually, I can even name the year, was 2010 or so. And I was trying to start a program for young entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs in Spain. Because I was leading the venture part of Ashoka, which is finding social entrepreneurs, and we realized we need more young people. So basically, I traveled the country, identified like 20 young people, under 35, that had launched some kind of social initiative. And we gathered them all in Bilbao, in the north of Spain, where Nico Williams is from. He was born in Pamplona, but he played in Bilbao. The guy who scored one of the winning goals for Spain yesterday. Was really exciting. But basically, we gathered there. There were a bunch of Germans too that came, some Belgians, some others that were working on similar things. And I was introduced to the art of hosting, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But basically, the idea is if you get the right people in the room and just let the conversation flow, the right ideas will come out. That's sort of the basis of art of hosting. I mean, obviously, it gets more complex than that, but that was sort of the idea. And we just let these people we said, look, we want change making to happen. We want to lower the barriers for change making for young people. What are those barriers? What should we do? And it was really interesting because the three groups, there was the Belgians, Germans, and Spaniards. The Germans, from the first minute, started planning out their things. And here's what we do in the constitution and the laws and stuff. The Belgians kind of argued for a while and then figured out some pieces. The Spaniards just got to know each other and enjoy each other and hear each other's stories for like 2 days. And in the last 4 hours, did all the work the Germans had done over the 2 days, because they had to build trust first. And once we all trusted each other, it's very quick to work through other stuff. So for me, and the reason I give those differences too, is because I realized this facilitation of letting people kind of express and sort of guiding, but sort of just letting that magic happen was so powerful. What made it magic though was I left Ashoka shortly after that to do some other stuff. and the funding that we had for this, which was very little and stuff, sort of fell apart. But that group of people have to this day, many years later, continued to gather and to bring experiences together and connect. So it was like this magic happened where we allowed connections to happen amongst people that kind of had some very deep common similarities or ideas. And it turned into a lifelong relationship, regardless of whether the program was funded or not. So that for me still is the basis and kind of the experience I look for. It's like when you're playing golf or baseball, or there's like a moment when you get the throw, or you're boxing. There's like a moment when that's how the muscles should work. That's the experience that I keep searching for. Like when that starts happening, you're on the right track for facilitation.
Oh, wow, love that, and thank you for also sharing the different examples. The structured, the German example. I think that's fascinating. The Belgium, more discussing and debating, and then the trust building, right? So do you find that one of those is better than the other, or you find it, like from the conversations that kept going, were the Spanish folks more like connected still because they spent more time connecting? What have you found in that?
That's a good, that's a good question, because right before this call, I was on another call as we're preparing to facilitate a very complex experience we call the Ecosystem Accelerator within Hello World. And we have people from Central and Eastern Europe. We have people from Northern Europe, like Germany and UK and stuff like that. And then people from Southern Europe. And I was saying, this is going to be a challenge because those three cultures connect differently. And obviously there's individuals with every culture that's different, but there are kind of some parameters. So I don't think one's better than the other. Like the Germans, that team ended up creating Changemaker Exchange, which is a very well-known organization that kind of connects these voices, and they did build trust. But I think cultures or a cultural experience kind of places us on different moments to start that conversation. Because maybe, and I'm throwing some stereotypes out here, but maybe more German-minded kind of people or the Nordics need a lot of that structure to feel comfortable with the structure to then build relationships, right? Whereas maybe in the south of Europe, it's a little more, I need to know the relationship is solid, that we can get along, and then we'll build the structure. The result ends up being similar. But I do think you have to, figure out, and so when you have different cultures together, you have to figure out pieces that allow structure, pieces that allow others, and kind of ask people, hey, you're going to be uncomfortable for a percentage of your time. But that's part of this process where there's going to be another time where you're comfortable and this guy's not. That's okay. We don't have to be comfortable the whole part. Otherwise, we'd never do multicultural. And I'm talking about like three cultures that are quite similar because they're all European. When you start bringing in, different groups that have been excluded traditionally, or minorities, or people that have been really put aside or have very different ways of communicating, it gets even more exciting as a facilitator.
Oh my goodness. It does feel like there's facilitators who do this like a workshop for students, in United States or in China, or, like super niche focused groups. And it does feel like the level of complexity you're holding with bringing multi-stakeholders from different backgrounds with different, what have you found? Like so it does seem like each person, from what I heard, each group finds their own way to operate and create that trust. How do you customize it? How do you make it not one size fits all? Do you just create spaces, or you do different types of activities, or how does that work for you to actually enable them to find their zone of, just a little uncomfortable, not panic, not too comfortable, but that middle zone?
I mean, I think part of it is saying it. So like one thing I keep discovering is when you say something and bring it out in the open, when you call out the discomfort that's happening, say this is real, a good percentage of that discomfort disappears. And I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I've learned a lot, even in like personal therapy, especially like for a white man like me that was raised to pretend he doesn't have feelings or something, when we say out loud, I feel anxious, which is one of the scariest things for me to ever say in my life, was to say I feel anxious, because anxiety I relate it to something that is not masculine or whatever, like a lot of baggage there. But when I say that, half of the anxiety that I feel disappears. It doesn't completely disappear. You have to deal with it, but just getting it off your chest, putting it, kind of pulling it out and putting it in the open. So I think there's one piece there that's enabling spaces where people can express, I don't feel comfortable with this, or this feels strange. Or as a facilitator saying, hey, I'm feeling some tension here, without shaming people. Right. So that's one piece. I think another piece that I found a lot of, and I think this is common knowledge, but who knows, is there's the group facilitation and then there's the individual conversations that need to happen in the background. And so often we don't think those should happen, or we don't spend time on those, but that's where the magic happens too, where to give an example, we had this one group that we were working with. I won't give details because I'll talk about someone in particular. And this one person just seemed to be trying to dynamite the whole group. And so I picked up the phone and I called this person. I spent, a couple hours, which is a big investment of time, but because I actually was interested in the perspective they were bringing and what they wanted to contribute, etc., and where they felt uncomfortable. And once we had that conversation, some stuff came out, but just saying, hey, we really care about this. How can we get it there? But also, do you realize what we're trying to do? It just flowed from then on, much easier. And so I think there's a bit of that, create the group, put the discomforts, like bring them out to the center, and then have those other conversations. And then I think that there's also the power dynamic piece that we just have to spend a lot more time acknowledging. I think I've been in many groups where facilitators were, from the more socially recognized or powerful kind of social group, and didn't have any real recognition of power dynamics. It's like in a group, in Europe where you have like white, Germans or something leading the group, and then you have Roma people or Black people that are part of the group as well. And they hadn't thought of the power dynamics that were going on, and it was a failure, or a lot of conflict emerged. Understanding that there are power dynamics and not pretending color blindness is real, I think is very important too. Like saying, okay, let's flip this around. This person never gets recognized in society to speak. Let's make sure they have a little more space here. This is what a friend of mine, Daniel Kerber, who leads More Than Shelters, who's also a brilliant facilitator, he talks about this as flipped workshops. I don't know if he came up with the term or not, but he uses it. He did that a lot with refugee camps, where he flipped the design of how to turn a refugee camp into like a city or a more permanent dwelling. Instead of bringing the architects in to tell the refugees what to do, he'd turn it around and say, you're telling these people what you need to be designed. And of course, they already knew what they needed. They had already started creating it. There were already like movable stores and all kinds of stuff going on. And they use that as the experience to build the city on, where architects, had more recognized education or whatever. They were serving the community, and it was, architects enjoyed it a lot more too, and the people funding it. So I think some of that flipping piece, recognizing those power dynamics, calling them out, really trying to avoid shaming people as well in the midst of that, which involves personal conversations. I think those are some of the things that make facilitation interesting.
Yeah. And I hear you on that. And I never really thought about, like how important it is to name things. Because what happens, you kind of make it from the unconscious conscious. From like, it's a stereotype in the background to like, hey, this is here, or hey, this is going to be uncomfortable. So then people can know that it is by design and not just randomly. So
it takes away fear too. Like when you enter to a forest you've never been in. I say forest because I grew up in the city. So a city for me always feels comfortable, but a forest makes me feel a little, if you've never been there, every sound sounds crazy, but and you get scared of different things. But when you have someone next to you that says, "Oh, that's an owl," or "That's a so and so," or "That's this," or that, they're calling out what the things are, all the fear kind of disappears, and you're like, "Oh, these are things to understand." Oh, that's a puma. We should run. Maybe that's one that makes you afraid. But calling some of these things out, when you see it, when you recognize it, when you know it's an issue, but not a hidden thing that's going to destroy your, whatever. I think it really helps. And again, it's a personal thing too. I've been finding more and more with psychologists and therapists, naming the emotions, naming the different things as specific as you can, apparently is something that really, really helps. kind of have the structure to work through those things.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. And how about Kenny? How about vulnerability here, for instance? Because you mentioned shame,
Mm.
and sometimes I do feel like when they are, let's say, the group that comes to mind in my mind is Serbians and Albanians. Since I am from Kosovo, Albanian, and it does feel like, my God, if you bring us in one group, in
Yep.
one place, there needs to be so much unpacking to be done,
Yep.
so much guilting, shaming, all of that is going to happen. But we won't I believe, pass any challenges to come up with anything meaningful without actually being heard and having that, being vulnerable to share those things. So what have you found, like,
Mm.
the role of really vulnerability and really going into, people expressing maybe the power dynamics a little bit, like, hey, let's examine this? Or is it just something we assume people know? What
Mm.
are your thoughts there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's like next level complexities, right? But I remember doing a lot of facilitation and being facilitated
Hmm.
in context of racial reconciliation or conversations. Reconciliation reconciliation in the U.S. between, especially for Black people, is almost seen as a cynical negative word because there's never been conciliation. You can't reconcile something that's never been.
Hmm.
And white people use it as a weapon often. And I include myself in those white people. So, but in those conversations, I go into these very complex pieces. Vulnerability is good, but there's a whole process to lead to it, and then there's weaponizing vulnerability that happens. So, like in the U.S., a lot of people use this term "white tears," where, and I've seen it so often. You're in a group, stuff starts coming up that is tough, and rather than taking it and listening, some people will be vulnerable. Will start crying or something like that to silence the conversation. That needs to be stopped. We
Hmm.
need to avoid doing that, and often we need to be brave rather than think we're vulnerable. So that I'm saying that I'm saying this because this is one example that I see often is like, let's not jump to vulnerability to silence the conversation, but rather maybe have some space for silence. So one thing that has really, really helped me in life was this saying that a Native American theologian said to me. I think it's like a proverb from his culture. He is a Lakota, and he said, "Seek the truth, and Creator will guide you. Seek the truth, and Creator will guide you." And he was saying this to me as a white person too. I was trying to fix all the problems of Native Americans and Black people and everyone in the United States all together in 3 years. That was my. And he was like, "Why don't you calm down for a second and spend time just dwelling and sitting in some of the truths that emerge,
Hmm.
and then you'll be guided to what needs to be done. But first, sit in that truth, learn that truth."
Hmm.
And this was really hard for me because I was trained to fix things, right? To get people together, come up with a solution. And so often the workshops or the experience that I facilitate or lead or am a part of have to do with finding a solution, right? Because I'm part of Ashoka, Change Makers, Hello
Hmm.
World, the Find Solutions.
Hmm.
But solutions emerge from understanding the problem deeply.
Hmm.
And so I think a lot of this, there's a vulnerability piece, but there's also like comfort with silence. And after a vulnerable moment, to just sit for a second,
Hmm.
let that truth penetrate, like figure out. So as a facilitator, how do you help your group or help the experience you're coming through have time for those silences and to just sit with things and not jump to that was wonderful or let's console this person or let's whatever. I know I'm not going answering the vulnerable question directly, but I think some of those things are the what allows people to kind of start expressing that vulnerability in a real way rather than using it as a cop out or as a weapon or as different things. I think on the flip side of that, just to kind of complete this and going back to power dynamics,
Hmm.
very often we expect and want and almost fetishize, if you allow me, vulnerability of the vulnerable group.
Hmm.
So, and we want to see that. We want to see the minority cry or express their thing. Or like I work a lot in migration, and so often conferences have to do with migrants that, that are very vulnerable, come out and give their testimony. Everyone cries. Then we ask them to leave the room and we make decisions for them. Like, that's evil. Um, why don't we become vulnerable and let people that are always vulnerable kind of listen or something? So, like, again, it's back to those power dynamics. Who's always being vulnerable? Who's always crying? Let's figure out what's going on here, and allow some of those spaces to emerge.
Oh, I feel like I need to sit with this truth, for some time, because it does feel like, the vulnerability has been seen as like that the connection between people, when people share. But also, I never really thought about it. How can it be weaponized? And I've seen some people with some stories, for instance, really dominate. Sometimes even including myself, like, oh, here I can be vulnerable. Let me share, what my story is, what all these things is, and then really kind of turning things about this, and not actually about the agenda. Thank you for sharing. I think that's really awesome. And how do you balance, into this? And we'll get into the ecosystem accelerator in a moment. But how do you balance this this need for organic transformation, of importing information and co-creating? How do you balance those? I'm curious. As a facilitator, it always feels like some people just want you to listen to slides. Some people are like, hey, let's just hang out, and some people are like, let's balance these three. And how do we do that? So that's the question.
Yeah. I think that is the tension in our sector, at least, constantly. And with the faith initiative that we worked on together, that was a bit of the question too, is like, we want this to develop, but people also want to get stuff done. What is that balance? And I think part of it's calling that out, like, we want to do both. One thing that I've found is setting outputs for a process that are tangible, but don't go too far. Don't make it something that requires all the time to work towards a project. So, for example, in our ecosystem accelerators, a lot of things can emerge from them. So there's a first phase that's like 6 months of intense conversations with a group of about 15 stakeholders from the sector around a subject, and then there's a second phase that's prototyping. But what we try to do is say, okay, this first phase, the ending of that phase is some recommendations. We're going to come up with 4 or 5 recommendations of what the sector can do, period. That's the output. Now, we hope that part of those recommendations and part of those conversations are also beginning to take shape around what a prototype could look like. But we're going to let people leave the process and new people enter the process if they want to for the prototyping phase. So we're almost separating the two, saying, let's have this first phase where we just let stuff emerge. We're going to write it down and program it and set it up in a way that can be shared with others. We're going to have some validation phases in between where others come in. So it forces us to express that, like to structure that in a way we can share. And I'll go back to that in a second. But also separating the prototyping or the building stuff from that phase, so that there is this, there's a lot from design thinking, right? That phase of developing and thinking and letting ideas emerge. And then there's a phase of trying to break it down, but distinguishing those phases while knowing that they enter into each other. But the other thing that for me was interesting, so I do a lot of public speaking and a lot in like churches and stuff, because I'm a pastor, I preach stuff. And there's sort of 3 phases to any public speaking that's serious. One is the research phase, where you get into the topic or the Bible verse or whatever you're talking on, and you research. I love that phase. I love reading, collecting information, bringing it all together. Then there's the second phase, which is systematizing all that you've learned into a digestible thing that you can share with others that they understand. I hate that phase. It's so freaking hard, right? Because you have to get, there's a very ugly expression, but something that you have to kill all your babies, all the great ideas you had, you have to knock them out and choose one idea that you're going to express. I mean, excellent public speaking, especially if it's short, like a sermon or a TED talk, is one idea. One idea with maybe reinforcing thing, but one idea. And you just researched about 20. So that phase is really key. And then there's the phase of like producing that, or sharing that or whatever, which I like as well. But that middle phase is hard. So with facilitation, one thing that I've done with this ecosystem accelerator and some other stuff is building in some validation phases throughout or moments throughout with a wider community so that the group is forced to systematize what they're learning into something digestible to share with others. And that gives you a bit of that structure and a bit of that building, but without necessarily having to force the whole experience there. So you can share some of that. People say, oh, I like this. I don't. You go back to big ideas. But it forces people to that, okay, let's bring this down to one idea we can share because other experts are coming in that are my colleagues and my peers, and I respect them. It's kind of like the principle in getting kids to teach other kids, which is really helpful for them to consolidate learning. I think with facilitation, we can do stuff like that as well, where we have these phases where we share halfway through the process or at different phases. So it's not just waiting till the very end. And remember in the Faith Initiative, one thing we did was have different groups present throughout the process what they were thinking, what their structure was to the others. And it really helped them consolidate and kind of get deeper into the work before like getting to the end and saying, oh, shoot, I didn't consolidate some of this information. So those are some things that have helped me, those on-ramps and off-ramps and stuff like that.
Oh my goodness. It does feel like digestion, huh? It's a real process as far as goes to like whatever experience. But even earlier you said to sit in the truth, and I do feel like there's a process there. I'm curious, Kenny. First, can you explain to us what is an ecosystem accelerator? It's and I've included in the description for everybody. You get to see some of the work that Kenny is doing. You get to see a link for the Social Innovations Journal. But can we hear it from you? How are you? What is an ecosystem accelerator? How did you all start it? And tell us how the program came to be.
Yeah, so I mean, briefly, Hello Europe, which was the organization that started this. Now it's Hello World because we joined with Hola America and have a broader thing. But basically, one of the main things we did was identify social innovations in the field of migration, help them scale. We have some really good tools to scale individual social innovations. But we also realized that these social innovations weren't enough to change the system on their own because the system was so complex, so messed up. It required rethinking through the whole thing. And often we see this within what we'd say ecosystems, right? Where there's the different players contributing to a common goal, like the ecosystem of migrant entrepreneurship, for example. You have the policy pieces, you have the what do you call them? The incubators and funders and different stuff. You have the entrepreneurs, you have the people that are buying the service. Yeah, universities, all kinds of stuff. So what you find is each one of these thinks that if the other entities did their job well, then everything would work because I'm doing the right thing. And we always see this from a broader perspective because Ashoka kind of brings people together and we're like, actually, you all need to erase everything you know and start over again. It's not everything, but you need to see this problem together. Well, how do we get people to see it together? So we started thinking, well, what if we brought together some, these key stakeholders and leaders within these stakeholders groups that are at a point in their career and in their thinking where they're ready for disruptive thinking, and they're thinking of the system, not just their organization. What if we brought them together and use some of the scaling tools that we have, but rather than saying, here's how you scale your organization, say, let's think of the sector as a whole. We use like the 5R system, which is where you find, you look at a system and think of the resources, the rules, the roles, the results. And there's another R I'm missing there. And how these dynamics are working and what you can switch, what you can improve. So let's think of that together as the sector. Let's spend some time going to the depths of this, or who are the key players, etc. And so that was sort of the idea: is let's bring them together. Let's gather them around social innovators that are kind of at a phase where they're thinking of the whole sector because they push it towards action. So often stakeholder stuff doesn't have social innovators and it becomes sort of, just a academic exercise or whatever, or it's pushed by one player alone. So let's bring them all together. Let's do this. Let's create that space. And then we have a wider community around these 15, which we call the validation community, or now we're calling it the support community, which are kind of experts in the field, the heads of the organizations and stuff. And we ask them to intervene 3 times to help us scope the initiative or the idea and the sector, and then to validate what this group is working on a couple times. that allows two things. One, what I was saying, the group to kind of develop stuff to validate. But secondly, these people take a good idea and they run with it. So it's a way to scale the ideas, assuming that they're going to be stolen, that someone's going to take them and run with it. Well, let's let that happen. Let's make it happen quickly. It's a very lean methodology in that sense, where you're creating, you're sharing, you're letting the ideas run, they're coming back. What happens with this is kind of interesting because this network starts building, these people start collaborating and connecting, and then we allow some room in the second phase for prototypes. So the first initiative we did was around migrant entrepreneurship, and we actually didn't have any funding for the prototype. So we were like, hey, try to build something. And a couple organizations emerged from that. The first network of migrant entrepreneurship in Europe, something called Starting New, emerged from the stakeholders within the system. It wasn't even something Ashoka was doing. We were trying to keep away from the final shaping because what we do is bring people together to think and create, but we don't necessarily want to lead the initiative afterwards. So that's a bit of the idea, is bring the stakeholders together, spend some time kind of putting your idea at the door and thinking deeply in the system, letting things emerge. So there's a little bit of theory U and some of the stuff there, recommending things to the sector, but also giving folks space if they want to build something, but also a lot of on-ramps and off-ramps. So, hey, you're part of the first phase. I'm done with that. I liked it, but I don't want to build a prototype. That's fine. Hey, there's someone else who wants to join the prototype. So having kind of on-ramps and off-ramps as well is something really key, because networks are fluid. Everything's so fluid. Let's try not to build something that's so structured. And the last piece here, I think, going back to this other, the expectations, was really setting clear expectations that can be fulfilled. Like, we're going to do recommendations. We're going to present these in a few conferences and pieces, and let each member kind of run with this information. So academics within the group started writing papers and putting together conferences about the topic because it was theirs. It wasn't Ashoka trying to bring a message to others. It was us convening people and saying, okay, here's what we all think should be done. Let's all share this in our forums, in our spaces, etc. So it was a really quick way to kind of spread change ideas.
Right.
So now we're launching two right now, basically, on migrant employment or migrant talent or socioeconomic inclusion, depending kind of how we frame it. One in Europe, one in Latin America, that will go in parallel and have these moments to exchange with each other, because in migration, we're seeing there's a lot of very interesting things to learn from each other, especially a lot to learn from the global south that normally doesn't get learned. I mean, talking about facilitation dynamics, everything in migration is global north is better. And it's basically not true. We do a really bad job in the global north with migration, essentially. But that's a whole nother, that's another podcast.
Wow, no, for sure. And honestly, like you mentioned so many components of this, Kenny. One component that I'm curious to just touch a little bit on is, how do you bring the right people in? How do you identify them? How do you decide what are the right stakeholders? And how important is that? Because it does feel like sometimes the type of people that come make it or break it. So how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think here is where Ashoka's best. So Ashoka can be bad at a lot of things, but one thing we're really good at is selecting people that are great thinkers, disruptors, and want to work together. And so we start with like fellows and people that we already know quite well within the sector and interview them. So we've actually done about 50, 60 interviews, hour and a half interviews of the people within the sector that we know, in kind of a bit of a popcorn approach, trying to hit on all the stakeholder groups and, aiming for diversity on a number of lines. Like, one is geographical diversity. So like in Europe, on migration, we need Central, Northern, and Southern Europe because of the broadness of the topic, et cetera, gender, different pieces. And then a lot of what we do in those interviews is try, first of all, see what people are bringing and what they want to bring to the conversation, how they see the topic, because we want to learn from them, but also try to identify, are these change leaders? Are these people comfortable with change? And again, this is for this particular experience, but I think that's a key thing for groups that want to aim towards change. These are people that are change leaders, that have influence, but really want to learn. They're curious, they're interested, they want to collaborate, they love Like when we talk about, here's some other people in the group, they go, oh, I'd love to sit with that person. Like in addition to kind of their expertise, their stakeholder experts, their leaders, like what are some of do they have that curiosity and that desire to spend time with people? Because they're going to do this for a significant amount of time. Like, is this part of the core of what they want to do with life? Because we're not paying them, to come to these conversations. This is like, does this advance your personal desire in life? And if your personal desire is to change the sector and improve conditions for migrants, to have better jobs and et cetera, then it'll be worth their time. But we have to like get into that. So
How do
some
you
it's intuitive. We do have criteria, but I think a lot of it's intuitive.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what about if somebody is like has power, and let's bring the power dynamics here. Let's say you're a policymaker, but you're pretty opinionated and you're there to maybe see what's out there. Like, have you ran into that? And or do you just because when I read some of the article, it felt like you strategically also input people. They're not part of the whole process, but they're strategically input. So I'm curious, how do you handle that dynamic of, hey, these are really important people. This is the CEO or the vice president of our corporation, of our business, and they need to hear what we're doing, but then they come and they take over and they steer a different direction. How do you deal with that? And I'm
Yeah.
throwing a lot of things.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
you mentioned both of them. On
Yeah.
the one hand, there's a lot of people that are in a position of kind of quick listening and applying, like a CEO kind of personality.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't invite them to the deep process because they probably wouldn't have the time or whatever, but they'd be great in the validation community. And they come to these meetings because you get in an hour to hear some of the deepest thinkers and doers in the sector, what they're concluding on stuff. Like that's worth the CEO's time or the head of IOM or whatever, On the other hand, we do get pretty high level people because we want people that are decision makers, but are also at a phase in life where they're playing with stuff, where they want to touch things, they want to, interact with others. And there are definitely power dynamics in that room that are crazy. Because also you have people coming from academia, from very practical stuff, from policy. They don't even agree on the term, and academic people will be like, we need to get the right term, even if it takes us 10 hours. And the social entrepreneur is like, I don't care about the term. Let's get something done. And so there's also that dynamic. So one thing I found is very strong facilitation. So at the beginning of this process, taking a bit of leadership, saying, I'm going to tell you what direction we're going into, and I'm going to push you in that direction. Is that okay with everyone? So this isn't an open group of like, let's just see what emerges, and because there are power dynamics. So first, I was telling someone this morning, you take the reins strong at the beginning. And slowly you start letting those things go. And this is an agreement you have with the team. Like we at Ashoka, we have the vision. We see what's going on. We stand a little aloof from the rest of the stuff. We're not going to stay with whatever emerges from here. We let it go. So it's not something we want to hold. Let us take leadership at the beginning and push you all in a direction. We also bring one of the social entrepreneurs on as a facilitator. So they're having a bit more power kind of to push that because they have this energy. And then we slowly let go. So in a sense, it's a more forceful facilitation, let's say, than if you did like a very broad process where you just wanted to see what emerged. And it's okay. There's different facilitation for different things. So that's something that requires a very mature, very leader that knows enough about the thing, that can also play these things, that can call people separate, say, hey, I hear you, but I'm going to push it in this direction. Is that okay? Or it doesn't matter if it's okay. I'm going to do this, but has a bit of that background because people want to be led at the beginning and then they want to lead. But most key stakeholders in the sector are sick of multi-stakeholder gatherings that produce nothing. Mm-hmm. They're like, someone take control of this a little bit and I'll contribute. And if I start liking it, I may ask for some power in this, but I want to see where it's going first. And so we said, okay, I'll take up that challenge. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it's a bit different. And I think facilitators need to realize that they need to do that sometimes and say it too. Like it's not a secret thing, but to say, I'm going to lead you all in this direction. And maybe it's not so in our group, there's a facilitator that isn't necessarily part of Ashoka. It can be, or it can be someone, but an expert facilitator. And then there's someone from our team that's very senior, that's part of the cohort but who's also part of the design team. So they're that leader whose job is to hold the reins and then slowly let these things let it go.
Wow.
It's incredibly complex,
Mhm.
as you can imagine.
Wow, wow. And this, thank you for that. That's so incredibly said. And one thing that stuck to me, and it's keep coming to my mind ever since you said it, you said, let the scaling of ideas happen, scaling ideas. And I don't think we talk about that much, Kenny. Like we usually are like, hey, come here and let's do a project after this, or let's, after this, there needs to be an initiative or an NGO or an MOU or whatever that is. And yes, I hear that, and that's it there too. But sometimes one idea can transform a whole ecosystem. So how did that come to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'll use migration as an example.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of great social initiatives or business issues, whatever, that are helping to make life better for migrants and use the skills they have and integrate and all this kind of stuff. There's also a lot of bad stuff happening. We started scaling those things. That's interesting, and there's ideas there and scaling some of that idea and that impact. But then we started connecting with policymakers because we realized those ideas scale through policy, et cetera. But then we realized, no matter how much we do those two things, if still the framework around migration, so the big idea, kind of a paradigm, in the best case scenario is poor migrants, they need our help. So then this is incredibly disempowering and nothing will ever happen. And I'm talking about the good narratives. The bad ones are like, oh, migrants are a threat or whatever. Like we know those are bad. But the good ones are like these poor things, rather than seeing migrants as the change makers that they are, that are bringing positive contribution, that have power. Maybe there's barriers to exercise that power. One of them might be a visa. One of them might be trauma. One of them, but these are change makers, and generally they have a higher entrepreneurial skills than others for a number of reasons. So we said, how do we change that framework to think differently? Those are the kind of ideas that need to be changed. Now, if we own that idea, if I say I own this idea, you have to buy, pay me trademark skill, it probably won't spread as quickly. But if I say, okay, I'm going to take that idea and shape it together and get others, because others people are thinking this too, but maybe I came up with the idea or whatever, or the way of phrasing it. If we can share this and spread it and people make it their own and start using it in other places, it's going to be manifested in different ways, but the idea is going to spread and kind of start changing the way people think. So that's like a big example. But even with more practical things like our accelerators that we used to do before or we still do in some cases with individual initiatives, we did these really well and people kept asking us, how do you do them? Can you help us? So we try to help, and then people would just copy it and do it. And we said, look, people are going to copy us, steal our ideas. Let's create a manual online for free for them to do it. If they want our help, that's great, but let's help people spread this stuff because we believe what we're doing is really helping the sector. Now, how to survive and be sustainable with that and still not make money, but for your organization to be alive, I think that gets pretty complex. But also we're in an age where sharing information is kind of expected, sharing information for free in many ways. And of anyone who has information. And what people will pay for is for you to help them process that information or bring it down more. So maybe we need to think a bit more along those lines. Like, how do we get these ideas concrete enough and out quick enough so that people can run with them? Half of them are going to do it a lot worse than you think they should. Okay. Another half is going to build on this and make something much better. Like, let's spread these things and see what happens.
Oh, love that. Love that, and because I do feel like a huge part of the output that we want is the actions, the execution. Making things happen. But if you have the wrong idea, you're gonna go in circles. So
That's
it
right.
does feel like it's an incredible investment, especially for people. And I do see Ashoka in this realm that spend so much time looking at patterns, looking at ideas, looking at frameworks and paradigms that spreading those is helpful. Um, one question that I have, I'm curious, Kenny, is there a way to that you've seen to measure these sessions? Because it does seem like, you're doing cross-sector collaboration, ecosystem activation, and it seems like an impossible task. And that's why I'm asking,
Yeah.
like, how,
Yeah.
with all this complexity, how do you know if there's follow-up? How do you know if there's, things going on? Do you send surveys? How do you keep the pulse in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this year we have a budget for impact measurement, which is always nice. Like that's one thing
Right.
that's helpful, and bringing an external person in, trying to get them to kind of understand the process and measure. But and even with that, I think there's a few things that can be measured. Like for example, what are the outputs? Are we achieving those? Are ideas being spread? And how many places that we know of are these ideas reaching? So like, our first accelerator, we had this guide that was developed, or recommendations for the sector. And we know from the people in our group how many times that was presented in different places, or we know some of those. That's one measure. Does that actually measure impact? I don't know. I mean, it reaches, how is that reaching people? How they care about that. We also measure how many people work together. So some of that survey, some of that's informal, like, hey, you've joined together to this. Have you joined with new people, etc. That's another thing. Again, is it the long-term impact? Not yet, but kind of, because that's one of the things we're promoting. For what we're seeing now is initiatives emerge that have this somewhere within them, but we're not 100% sure where it came from. So there was a big campaign, for example, by a major, one of the largest organizations that works with refugees. The theme was migrants are change makers, or refugees are change makers.
Mm.
And we saw that, like, this is amazing. And as far as I know, we're the first organization to talk about migrants as change makers, etc. But we couldn't trace back whether this organization had actually taken that idea from us or somewhere else. So it was interesting because on the one hand, we know we have a hand in that occurring, but we can't, with any ethical seriousness, report that as systemic impact. So there's a game we have to play there, right? Because most systemic or framework impact is measured by anecdotes, by stories. Like that, it's almost impossible to measure it with actual numbers, at least to measure it back to you. I think you can measure an impact, but you can't necessarily say this was me, because it's been spread so quickly to so many people. So even in the way that I talk about impact measurement sometimes is, what is our contribution to this, and what are, along with the other contributors, what are we seeing? So almost thinking of it a bit more as a movement. Now, raising funds with that is complex. Of course, Ashoka has a bit of an advantage in that sense because we're very well situated kind of in the thought leadership or whatever. I think we get credit for stuff we didn't do even sometimes because of our fellows or whatever, so that's an advantage in one sense. But I think we also have to be very humble and realize, like, we're just convening people to come together and sharing those ideas, and then things emerge. Was the convening the only place they met? Probably not. Was it a key piece? Hey, it probably was. So, for example, in this organization that emerged, Starting New, which is this first network of organizations working with migrant entrepreneurs, etc., in the story that they told of how they emerged, they mentioned the Hello Europe Ecosystem Accelerator, because that was literally where the idea. Oh, that's wonderful. But now what they do from now on, it's not necessarily, I don't know if I can report that as my impact, but I'm very proud that I was able to facilitate that. So I think there's a little bit of a game, but telling these stories and sharing impact in a way that's saying we're contributing to this together, I think is important, because one of the big mistakes I think that's made in our sector is obsessing with very small metrics and giving people very little money to achieve very direct impact, rather than investing in relationships and other things. And to be a bit controversial here for a second, what a friend of mine who researched like the far right funding and how they funded a lot of these major initiatives, they basically gave tons of money for people to meet and connect with each other and spend time with each other. They didn't really care what they were doing. Now the impact, we're all seeing the impact. Are the Koch brothers the key people for that impact, or was it so and so or this? We don't know, but they're definitely getting their goals in many sense. Maybe we need to rethink through. Can we invest in relationships and people connecting and kind of measure the impact at a much larger scale, rather than, did you feed 35 and a half children, with per dollar that I get or whatever the weird measurements are. So
Hmm.
I think there's a conversation to be had there too. And I also think at the same time, I think we should audit some of the impacts that people are saying they're having, especially direct impacts, because there's a lot of money going to things that I don't think should be funded,
Hmm.
frankly.
Amen.
Another podcast for that.
Another podcast. Kenny, when I hear this, I also feel like the role of a facilitator is something that sometimes is undervalued because there is not the facilitators are not the leaders like I led this movement, they're willing to step their ego down to bring other egos and help them step their egos down so that they can come together and create change, and then you let go of that. It almost feels like you you help facilitate a baby and then you give it up for adoption. And and in today's society it
Mm.
feels so polarized. It feels so, like all types of ways going in so many different directions. Do you feel that, what do you feel about the role of facilitators for now and the future? Do you see that something that is vital, or how do you see that?
Mm. No, that's a great analysis. Should change the name to ego managers. Um, but I think you're like, I'm just reflecting on myself and how little I value the role of facilitator. Even though I exercise that, I'd never say I was that. I'd much prefer to say I'm a leader, leading this or leading that. But the majority of in-depth, like really deep learnings and moments where my life has been changed has been through very skilled facilitators and groups, which is interesting. And also a lot of the skills that if I'm attentive to and think about that help me manage very polarized conversations in my day-to-day life or whatever come from some of that facilitation of breathing, of taking time of feeling the warmth of your body. Some stuff that facilitators are very skilled, or listening to others or stopping or exercising. So it's interesting because I'm like, they brought a lot, but still we don't quite recognize. I think it's one of the skills that's absolutely necessary for the future and should be valued a lot more, in many ways. Like for this process, and what's interesting is you do value it when you really need it.
Hmm.
So like for this process, we finally have some funding for facility. We chose, the two or three people we know are really good because we know these are high quality, really need um, key things. And I think more and more organizations are recognizing it. Like within Ashoka Europe, for example, we spend significant resources on facilitators, external facilitators in particular, because our conversations are complex. Like when you're dealing with restrictive funding and stuff like that, it gets really messy. And so we need someone from the outside to just help us. And when you find a good one, it's like a lifesaver. Or a good, I mean, let me phrase that. Someone who fits like the needs that you have. Because sometimes there's good facilitators that don't fit,
No.
what the particular group needs or whatever. But sometimes you find those people that really connect. Gold. So, how do we promote that gold more? Um,
Hmm.
is a good question.
Yeah, wow. Kenny, this is what a conversation, and I think we agreed to have another 3 episodes just based on this, and more, because there's so much to unpack. And maybe my final question to you is, what advice would you give to facilitator that is just getting started, or someone not even just getting started? Just what advice do you have for like a facilitator that can help them be better facilitators and drive change?
Hmm. What advice would I have liked to get? I mean, I think the first thing that came to mind when you were saying that is don't be afraid. And I don't say that from a patronizing kind of perspective, but really I think I say it because often I've been thrown into facilitation situations and I've been dead from fear. Like, oh, I'm gonna do this wrong. I don't know how to do it. I don't have a calm presence. I'm not a good person. I want to lead this. And two things have really helped me there. Like the responsibility of saying, okay, I'm responsible to these people to leave this experience in a better place. And that's a pretty heavy responsibility to hold. And then secondly, really looking back to great facilitators who have led me, and I just copy people bluntly. I've never been trained as a facilitator. I don't think ever any kind of training, or I probably should. I'm not saying this is a positive thing, or coaching or anything like that, but I've been in the presence of masters that have, like one pastor I connect a lot with. He says it's a non-anxious presence. You know, when you're in the presence of someone who's a non-anxious presence, who's calm, who can bring things together, like that's what we want to aim for. So who's the master, you know, that you're learning from? Who's the person you could sit at their feet and kind of just be in processes they're facilitating from, and then look back to that person when you're in those situations. That for me has been really key, because you learn by doing. There, I don't think there's any kind of training that really prepares you for facilitating except being in the process. I mean, I don't know if that's good advice, but that's sort of what comes to mind is getting rid of fear, looking to those people. If you haven't been in well facilitated spaces, find some good facilitators and ask to shadow them or something, because that for me is the best way of learning, just seeing how people deal with this. And I think that happens a lot, right? There's like shadowing processes and stuff, but that's where I've learned. And then afterwards going to the facilitator and like, what happened there? He's like, well, did you realize this person was red in their face and this other person was there? So I decided to throw in like a third thing. You know, there's all these things they do that we don't see. And if you're able to have some time to process with them and see it, and you'll also start realizing your intuition is probably better than you think. But having intuition isn't enough. You need to know what to do with the intuition, right? So that is like 20 pieces of kind of lightly connected sort of advice.
I love that, you know, and that also spoke to my heart, because that's, you know, like we have kind of given up on the idea of apprenticeship as a way to actually learn, and facilitation cannot be really learned by, hey, read this, see this PowerPoint or do this thing, but to actually get in front of masters, talk to people, join workshops, you know, try to start with a workshop at home, you know, like don't like conquer that fear, dive into that fear. Kenny, man, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we're gonna continue this conversation in so many ways, but I thank you for your work also. You know, as a fellow migrant, as a fellow former refugee, I also feel like so grateful when I hear these initiatives. Really make my heart so happy, and I wish you the best. And for the audience, you can find Kenny on LinkedIn, in so many places. Reach out. He's open and eager to drive change. So Kenny, thank you for being here. I appreciate you, man.
Thank you, Mentor. This was really, really fun, and I appreciate you putting these things together because I think they're really needed. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.